Hey there, and welcome back to another MCU video. And today, I want to talk a little bit in depth about the quality of the MCU, or maybe more specifically, the decline in the quality of the MCU in recent years. Now, as we all know, the MCU is the name given to the cinematic universe of Marvel heroes, combining films and now TV shows, and telling both shorter, more specific stories, and also longer, overarching narratives that stretch across multiple franchises, most notably the Infinity Saga. And I think at this point, it's safe to say that this is one of history's most ambitious cinematic projects of all time. A hell of a lot of time and money has been invested into this thing. Dozens of films and a new wave of streaming shows on Disney+. And it's really brought about a whole new era for the film industry as a whole, whilst also being one of the most successful and lucrative franchises of all time in terms of box office earnings, having earned over a combined total of $27 billion, which is more than any other film franchise ever. Plus, by the end of the first saga, the Infinity Saga, which saw the machinations of Thanos come to fruition in a two-part extravaganza, Infinity War and Endgame, the MCU as a whole became one of the biggest events in film history, permeating pop culture in a way that very few franchises have ever been able to do, and joining the likes of Star Wars and Harry Potter, far-reaching franchises that are going to be remembered forever as cultural phenomenons of their time. Hell, you could probably add Game of Thrones to that list as well. The hype was intense, and when the show was running, before its epic downfall, it was all anybody would be talking about. And so yeah, Avengers and the MCU became another member of that star-studded pantheon of groundbreaking franchises that had been cultivated over 10 years. And it had it all. The stars, the prestige, beloved characters, and new rising stars that looked primed to take the MCU into a brand new era and revitalise the story being told. A changing of the guard moment. And since then, we've had lots of films and the rise of Disney Plus as a major streaming service, which saw Marvel start to dip its toes into making more long-format works. For the first time, we're getting Marvel shows, or at least Marvel shows that directly tie into the MCU, and which could be used to give different characters who might not be ready for a standalone film a chance in the spotlight, and also introduce a whole host of new characters. After all, there's only so many films you can release per year, and so the Disney Plus shows give them that chance to continue introducing new and diverse characters, and creating more and more story arcs that can be enjoyed all at once. Which in theory, sounds pretty damn awesome, right? And indeed, I felt like it did get off to a good start. But then for me, all of that sort of started to fade away, and it feels like maybe the MCU's over the hill. It's starting to descend, the quality's dropped, and the franchise just doesn't quite feel the same anymore. And so, that really is the purpose of the video today. To sort of walk through some of the reasons that I think the MCU's just not what it was, and explain my feelings of discontent. So, I'll start off with the obvious one, the lack of central focus of the narrative. And that really covers a couple of things. One, there really isn't much of an overarching story being told here. We know from the timeline that's been presented that this story's building up to Kang and the multiverse. And yeah, we're seeing some of these seeds being planted. But for the most part, we're still just seeing a lot of origin stories and a lot of setup. But it's not setup that seems to be tying anything together, but more for individual different franchises. And look, I know the MCU's always done this, but I think when every couple of years you'd have a new Avengers as a way to pay off a number of arcs at once, and fewer films in general to lead into them, it worked a lot better. But here, there's just a lot of stories with no real payoff, all built into some vague film still years away. And so, many of these arcs do feel incomplete or like they're leading into nothingness. And then in turn, this ties into the oversaturation of the MCU itself. And I'm not just talking about the shows, but with the films as well. There's just so many different characters, and each of them different and unique, and worthy of their own film or program. Back in the early MCU though, these characters would have had to make do with being a character in other films. I mean, look how long it took for Black Widow to get her own film, or for Hawkeye to get his own solo project. But now, we're seeing all of that and more for so many different characters, and thus the story's becoming less and less streamlined, and instead, becoming a bit bloated. Instead of having a rather straightforward sequence of films, now to try and keep up with every different storyline, you need to watch all the films, and all the shows. And there's a lot of them, and many of them contribute small pieces to a larger whole, or have contextual information that is important going forward. But this in turn, it just builds up fatigue. There's so much to watch, and it's relentless. You hardly have time to digest what's going on, and what you've seen before you have something fresh that you need to watch. It's gotten to the point that there's just so much to keep track of. All the storylines, they're so busy and convoluted. And for me, it is driving down my interest. I'm not a firm believer in hardcore streamlining, and neither do I think that things should be dumbed down or oversimplified simply because some people don't get it. But at the same time, I also think we've kind of hit the MCU's carrying capacity. There's so many characters, each competing for their spot, and we have so many different storylines, many of them disconnected from one another. And so we have a film come out, and then there's no real chance for any sort of follow-up. Whereas before, we'd see these characters again more frequently. But now you have to wait. The schedule's out. We've seen what's coming. And we've seen that so many different characters and franchises are going to have no real follow-up to their stories in the works. They just have to wait until after Avengers. And yet despite that, many of their stories were left on cliffhangers, or with things left unfinished. And so this is kind of frustrating for me. It makes it really hard to connect with the characters and their arcs, as they're so thinly dispersed. And you really do have to wait for years for any sort of follow-up of any real substance. And on top of that, I feel like the franchise now lacks for any real central anchor character. I'm talking about an Iron Man or a Captain America, and I guess to a lesser extent Thor, but obviously much more the first two. A character who's the main driving force behind a lot of the narrative development, and who crops up again and again in various different ways. Look at how central those two characters were during the MCU's first big run. They were core, central characters who had the most important roles to play, both in the lead-in films and then also the team-up films where the big payoffs would happen. They were the central focus. And this sort of central focus is really important in a film franchise, as it gives a lot of narrative direction. I mean, ensembles are great, don't get me wrong, but you still need leads within that ensemble. Even in films like The Guardians or Eternals, where the draw is the whole team, you still have lead characters. Star-Lord, Gamora, Cersei, characters that the story and ensemble build around and play off of. And honestly, at first, it did feel like they were setting up for this sort of thing going forward after Endgame. For me, it seemed very clear that Spider-Man, Black Panther, and Captain Marvel were kind of being primed up to be a new big three for the franchise to build around. And yeah, I think Spider-Man has kind of had that. He's had 2 films since Endgame, which is far more than anybody else has had, and his storyline did help to set up the events of Doctor Strange and the multiverse, and brought him into the fold in his 3rd film as well. But the 2 other sides of the triangle, well, they're just not there anymore. Sadly, Chadwick Boseman obviously passed away, and he was the actor for Black Panther. And this, in turn, would have obviously seen things change, removing one of those potential narrative anchors. But Captain Marvel, I don't even know what happened. It feels like her story was just mostly dropped or put on hold. I mean, you can see that they're clearly setting up for a big thing with the Marvels. She has a history with Rambo, and Kamala is her superfan. But I can't help but think that having her interact with those characters prior to the film might have been a bit of a better choice, and made her seem like more of a central focus. Someone from that film needs to be that main character. But here, I just don't think she's being set up like that. And in turn, she doesn't really feel like an MCU mainstay at this point, which I feel like's a bit of a mistake, but maybe that's me. And I think that really is the major issue with the modern day MCU. There's just so much of it, and so many heroes, so much story potential, and yet it almost comes across as too much, especially since for all this content, they lack a lot of narrative focus, which in turn hampers the MCU's quality. And I don't think this is the death knell of the MCU. I'm not an idiot. I don't think it's going to cause irreversible damage, but I do think that things need to change going forward if they want to hit those same heights as they did with Infinity War and Endgame, where the world at large was so highly invested in those films. But yeah, regardless, I do think the MCU's on a little bit of a decline in terms of its quality, and I do hope it bounces back, because I like the MCU. Go figure. I don't want it to fail. I don't want it to be bad. I want to enjoy myself while watching my superheroes fight. I'm a simple man with simple needs. But anyway, with all that being said, these are just my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of the MCU? You think it's still going strong? Or is it starting to falter? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.